and I'm going to just introduce the speakers by first name, and then quickly they'll tell us shortly about themselves. So Christopher, you will start off.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Christopher Ogumadede. I'm an associate editor at World Politics Review. I cover African politics, international affairs, economics, trade, security. I write a weekly newsletter called Africa Watch, where I essentially look at the themes that I just talked about. I like to describe myself as a recovering diplomat because I spent so many years in the diplomatic world, and I've walked away from that now. I prefer to talk about diplomacy and not do it anymore. No regrets, by the way. So I essentially am a commentator more on foreign affairs as opposed to a practitioner that I used to be. But, you know, there's every now and then I have to put on my practitioner hat.
All right.
And I enjoy that. So I'm glad to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tanubi, just quickly tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Miriam. I'll make it very quick. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Tanubi Ngangong. I work with the Observer Research Foundation. I'm the Chief of Staff and Programs at ORF. I also do a little bit of research on the global development architecture, and hence I'm here on this panel. Lovely to be here. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. David?
Good morning, everybody. I'm David, multilateral issues, and also run a program supporting the UK and India to work together to share good practice in development space.
Thank you very much, David. Valina?
Good morning on my side. It's great to be here. Evelina Chakarova is my name. I'm director of the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy based in Vienna. We are actually at the inbox side of the political process in Austria, and I'm also instructor at the Real World Risk Institute led by best-selling author Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan or Anti-Fragile.
Thank you very much. And I'm Dr. Miriam Omolo from the African Policy Research Institute in Kenya. I do a lot of work in trade, development, and public finance. We are talking about the brand. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What are some of the lessons we are going to learn about it? So I'm going to start off with Christopher. Please tell us, from your experience, you've been a diplomat, a writer. What's your experience when it comes to the issues of Bretton Woods? We are getting more development partners, more financiers. What are these approaches? Are they good, bad? So let's just say the good, the bad, the ugly.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
I will speak mostly from the perspective of West Africa, where I live and where most of my work experience has come from. And I will naturally start from the experience with China as the main alternative to the Bretton Woods institution. So when you look across the board in Nigeria, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, Mali, Senegal, it's impossible to miss the preponderance of Chinese infrastructural projects in rail, bridges, dams, but also on the much less hard side of the infrastructural development. There's a lot of industrial parks, agricultural products, a lot of medicines as well. There's so much that the Chinese are bringing in terms of investment and spending that many of these governments actually want and desire. You know, one thing I've certainly heard from many governments across the region is that they welcome an alternative to what they regard as the stringent conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank, but also other partners like the Europeans. And there's also, Turkey is very much a player. The main airport in Senegal was partly funded by two Turkish companies. In Nigeria as well, there are lots of Turkish hospitals. There are lots of Turkish-run schools. The Marif Foundation is very active across Mali, Senegal, Nigeria, Niger, and so many parts of the region. So what we are seeing is many governments welcoming a multiplicity of voices, of partners. Many people trying to, essentially what African countries want is as many opportunities as they can get. You hear trade ministers, finance ministers, foreign ministers, investment ministers say things like, we don't want to have to take a side in this ramped up geopolitical, great power politics world that we live in, whether or not, we want to acknowledge it, that's the reality of it. And as much as these countries can't control that, they are also willing to play the game as they see it. And one of the ways they see the ability to get what they want out of it is to participate in a multiplicity of development finance sources. And it's not just, as I said, in infrastructure. Now it's a lot of climate finance. The $100 billion pledge that was made in 2009 was not fulfilled. And many of these governments complained about that at COP26. They felt that they were let down. Their adaptation and mitigation plans were not fulfilled, which has severe consequences for their infrastructural development plans. By the way, there's an interconnection there, and they feel that the ability to make deals, bring in partners from as many places as possible, not just China, but also, as I said, Turkey, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia. Gone is the world where the big three, as I like to call it, the US, China, and the European Union, collectively get to determine how these countries, develop their development and financial and social development plans. They want to include as many people as possible. So that includes now a South Africa. That includes, as I said, a Singapore. That includes a South Korea. When you look across the board, there are so many more players in ways that were not true 20, 30, even 50 years ago, and these countries welcome that. And I personally think that's a good thing, but it also calls for some introspection, it calls for some care, it calls for some diligence, for some pragmatism, and above all of these countries need to have a sense of purpose. They can't have a take-it-all mentality. We'll get this from Russia, from China, from Indonesia, from Turkey. It's fine to take that, but you also need to know what are the terms and conditions. How do they fit into your development plans? So that's my experience from doing the work that I've done. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and very interesting perspectives, because what's coming out here is that don't just go looking for this development financing and opportunities. What are your plans? What are your priorities? Of course, we say variety is the spice of life. But is that variety helpful in this case? Green financing or green growth, is it working for us? And even as we are continuing with our discussions, let's ask ourselves, he's talked about China and infrastructure. Does the Chinese infrastructure promote vertical integration or horizontal integration? When we talk of vertical, it means you're opening from the hinterland to the seaports. Or are you improving connectivity within your territories? So I would like us to proceed next. And Tanubi, as a practitioner, welcome. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Miriam. I'm not a practitioner.
In terms of implementing, yes, sorry.
But thank you so much, Miriam. And let me take it from where, Christopher, you left off. And underline this point, which is the key anchor, I suppose, of this panel, which is that we today face a crisis of faith in the Bretton Woods institutions. They are not the single scripter of the development architecture norms and framework, and we have new actors. We're questioning their prescriptions, we are questioning their recommendations, their lending policies and practices. So one of the driving questions is, what are the new approaches and mechanisms? And like Christopher, you said, we have many new actors in the global development landscape today. Be it China, that you talked about, which is characterized by state-led, oftentimes state-funded larger projects. The question that we have to ask is, what's the capacity building that's coming out of these projects? The questions that we have to ask, what are the linkages and how sustainable are these projects for the local community? Commercially, how sustainable are these projects that the recipient countries or the partner countries can pay it back? what are the different other types of actors that are emerging? Let me also give you a brief of the Indian example, which perhaps may be an example that kind of showcases the other actors that are emerging in the global development landscape. Much like the new emerging actors in the global development finance landscape, India's development model is based on broadly 3 principles. The first is, as you said, Miriam, the horizontal exchange of ideas, of experiences, that is based on principles of solidarity as emerging actors, as developing countries partnering together. The second is that it is based on a demand-driven approach where the partner country is at the driver's seat of the project. The third is a respect for national ownership and sovereignty. The other thing is that we need to understand that the role of the private sector is going to be increasingly more important in the global development landscape. And the Indian example also provides certain light on this. For instance, the largest part of India's development assistance or partnerships, which is through the concessional lines of credit, is primarily a private sector-led model where private capital investment is funneled in for development projects. And I think this ties in well into the larger question of, in this new development landscape, what is the framework that the Bretton Woods institutions need to develop, and what they can learn from perhaps the new emerging actors. I think one of the big challenges that they will have to learn is that they will have to learn to taste their own medicine, which is to, competition has always been encouraged for the countries that the projects of the BWIs have gone to. They need to learn to survive in a competitive global development landscape where they're not the single sole scripters of the norms of global development anymore. They will need to be more nimble and agile. They will need to learn to not only work with state governments in the developing countries, but also the private sector in creating commercially viable, sustainable projects that lead to capacity building. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much for those insights. Now talking to David as a senior political advisor with the British High Commission, this space is widening. I know Britain or UK has been part of this space for a while. Do you think new players is a good thing, a bad thing? Where does that leave us? I know you have a lot of experience in this area. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. So, yes, there are a lot of new actors. There are new countries emerging and engaging. The private sector is playing a big role. Yes, it makes it more complicated. Yes, these new actors are shaping the narrative. But no, that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. There is, as is alluded to in the title and in the flow of the session, there's an awful lot more bilateral development going on now. I understand that Nigeria has taken something like 145% more bilateral politics in the same way it's always been. Countries giving aid to develop influence, build friendships, create relationships. But also we need to remember that from when the Bretton Woods institutions were developed, the global economy is now completely different. In the 1950s, GDP was something like 5 trillion. It's now 95 trillion. At some point in the near future, India's GDP on its own will be equivalent to what global GDP was at the end of the Second World War. So the world economy has changed. It's richer. There's a lot more money. We heard that a lot yesterday. People saying there is money. We need to make it work. And it's in different places. And so it's perfectly normal and natural that these new centers of wealth seek to use their money for development abroad. Countries like mine, as you alluded to, have been doing this for a long time. There's no reason that others shouldn't. And if we look at Rwanda as an example, so the UK is working bilaterally with Rwanda to support a fantastic program to work on advanced cooling systems for the next generation. Green growth. We know that the planet is warming up. We know that there will be increased demands for cooling. Thanks to Rwandan leadership developing the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, we will need to do this better, and we're supporting and working with them to do that. But also in Rwanda, India has been supporting solar electrification of schools in rural areas, a big hydroelectric program, supporting irrigation that will allow better export and increased growth. So there's nothing wrong with that. The Rwandans should be able to work with the UK, they should be able to work with India. The key is the way that this work is done and what goes on behind it. Now, we've said new actors are coming in, and actually some of these actors are bringing in a lot more than just money. So India is a center for innovation, it's a center for technology. There are, more unicorns every week. And if you can explain unicorns, you're probably smarter than I am. But, so the UK and India are now working on something called a Global Innovation Partnership, recognizing that India is a center of excellence in this space. We're funding 50-50, and we will take innovative development solutions from India, grow them, and export them to other parts of the world where they're wanted to support development. So new actors bringing not just money, but also expertise and a completely new view of the way these things work. This doesn't mean that the Bretton Woods institutions are peripheral, they remain central. We saw in the pandemic, the woman from the World Bank mentioned yesterday, 150 billion money created and passed out during COVID, at a point where, if we're being honest, few of our countries, certainly the big countries, were behaving in a way that, I suspect all our citizens would really want to have done. Billion money created and passed out after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, trying to mitigate some of the huge impacts that that's having on the global economy, and money going into West Africa to support food security and enhance food production. So it's playing a massive role, and a role that I don't think any other body could play, and potentially that we would want another body to play. It is better, for all of its failures, to have a universal body that operates transparently doing these things. The same with the IMF. So I live in New Delhi, that's just Tanubi. There are 4 big economies in South Asia, and as of today, as we sit here, 3 of those are only able to import because of IMF support. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, only able to operate today because of support from the IMF. So these structures, although they're not perfect, and ultimately every multilateral body needs reform the day after it's founded, so this isn't unusual. Not perfect, need to be better, but still remain absolutely central. And if we think about the mission, because one of the questions was looking about, do they need a new mission, do they need a new ethic? The World Bank mission is ending poverty. I think we would all agree with that. That's a perfectly laudable thing. There are ways that you can go about it better or worse, but ultimately that's a good thing. IMF ensuring stability. Again, that's something that I'm sure that all of us sat here can agree on. So we've got new actors. We've still got the institutions that we've had since the late 40s. They are working in parallel sometimes in competition. I think the thing we need to remember possibly, though, is that as we sit here, halfway through Agenda 2030, after a devastating pandemic, a war going on in Ukraine with huge impact across the global economy, and the impacts of climate change being ever more felt, actually we don't need fewer development actors, we need more. And the key, though, is how they operate. And Tanubi alluded to this in her answer. I think as long as the development work being done is demand-driven, it builds capacity and wealth, and it doesn't leave behind it unsustainable debt and issues around sovereignty, then ultimately we should welcome the new complexity, the new picture, and the fact that there are more development actors in the world.
Thank you very much. I've had a lot of issues being raised right now. One, we have there's no problem with many actors. So it means multiplicity of visions and missions. And previously, we've been told that we must have our own development agenda. What's our development agenda? So it looks to me like we are having we have our shopping list, and then we have various supermarkets to go to, in my opinion. Now, I would like to come to Velina. The advantage you have is you can summarize everything they've said. Yes, when you're the last panelist, sometimes everyone says what you want to say. But you have the advantage of still telling us what's your opinion or what's your take, especially on now these various actors. Is there a lot of poaching taking place? Please, yeah.
Rising share of global GDP and the cake remained the same, even though, of course, the numbers are now different. Of course, China presented its own ideas and its own, projects, starting with the One Belt, One Road back in the 2013, then later transferred to the Belt and Road Initiative 2015. In fact, this unleashed a new competition because right now, if you take a look at the main developed economies, like the United States or the European Union bloc, Japan, they had to come up with their alternative ideas, with their alternative infrastructure, huge infrastructure projects like the Global Gateway of the European Union, now the newly signed infrastructure plan of the United States, and then of course we have the regional players. So that means that even at the macro level there is a huge competition over the hearts and minds of every part of the world, but then again, of course, it will have the signs of the power behind it. So, of course, it's once again about national interests and about geo-economic interests. And a final point on my side, because it's a transitionary period, we don't know how it will develop. We may end up with Pax Americana 2.0 after this transitional period if China is not able to convert this huge geoeconomic portfolio into a global power projection. It's still centered and evolving around one global reserve currency, and in fact, currently there is no other state actor that is able to play this role in the world. If you look at the second, third globally shared and traded currencies, we are still having this, superiority of one currency with all the bad implications, of course, specifically for emerging powers, which means that there is a question mark.
There was lack of public. Can I leave it to 1, 2, 3? 1, 2. There's a lady here. Second, third, fourth. Yes, then we'll take another round. All right. The first one, please introduce yourself. Then just be very succinct and clear on your point so that everyone can... Oh, all right, that's fine. Sorry, that's okay.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
So my name is Shaima Riyad Saleh. I'm founder of the Women Collective in UK. I have a question to all the panelists. As long as we are all agrees about the new actors that are needed in the global system and the global development, I'm totally agree with all the points that you raised regarding that we are living in a very diverse world that nowadays. But I got this question about what is the role of the new actors when they come to the finance global system. If we need them to have money show up, they got as well political ambitious goals. So in the Western world, and especially the superior, like superpower we live in, and they will give them the chance to be as a collective in development. They are going to be a collective partners as well in the politics. And if this happens, what kind of relationship will be and the partnership to be shaped with the Western world? If we are talking about the global South countries as well, like Indonesia, Nigeria, and South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Henriette Esterhuizen, I'm from South Africa. I'm from an international NGO network, Association for Progressive Communications. Just two questions, but you made me ask the second one, which is about global dialogue or national dialogue about the lending. And there seems to be even less dialogue about engaging with these new actors than there has been about engaging with Bretton Woods. So would you agree? And if you do, how do we change that? But secondly, What is the impact of this diversified set of actors on debt and on the debt burden? Having diversified its borrowers, its borrowing hasn't helped Sri Lanka very much. So I didn't hear any of you really address that particular issue. And perhaps you want to look at that from a short, medium, and long-term perspective.
Thank you very much. Then, okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Gilbert Nyandeji. I'm the CEO of Africa Cyber Defense Forum. I'll appreciate the fact that at least the panelists have brought the angle that we have now multiplicity of the development partners that come in. But the question I have, and I'll bring it more maybe from the cybersecurity angle, where, for example, you find that in as much as, yes, lots of the development partners, right, the money that comes in, let's say to the global south, let's say Africa and the rest of the parts, always come from, the IMF, World Bank, and of course the bigger players. But the problem you always find is always a lot of duplicity in some of the efforts, where you go in an institution, for example, you find that, yes, there's funding that came from European Union, there's funding that came maybe from the UK, and they're actually more or less doing the same thing. There are cases like that. And there are cases where we have seen policies written by people sitting in AC rooms in London, and they come and stay in hotels and fancy hotels like this. Then they design policies, and once they design the policies, those things don't work because they never involve the local people. I don't know what's your take on that. Thank you.
Good morning. I think we are being very polite here. I'm Pranjal Sharma from India. I think we have to address a very simple fact, which is what I call addiction to aid. There is a serious addiction to aid, which is being encouraged by Western governments, by Bretton Woods. There's a layer of global NGOs who love to have this aid flow because, it creates a lot of employment in the system across the world. Why is nobody talking about this? That why is not there a focus on entrepreneurship? And when you hear the Western leaders talk about diversity of funds, it's with a hint of sadness. Oh, I wish China and India and Turkey were not doing this. Because, we are used to giving. We don't want other people to come and, fight for that and influence. Even in 2022, you have a situation where a country like France controls the monetary policy of 14 African countries. Is anybody addressing that? If we do not look at issues like this, it's just going to be very polite talk. But the point is, I think for all developing countries, you have to reject aid and encourage entrepreneurship. India did that, Thailand has done that, and the countries that you all mentioned. If you remain excited about aid, then the whole concept, Bretton Woods and all these are colonial structures. They were meant to maintain influence over the countries that they were, controlling at some point. They're just doing it in a more sophisticated way. So I think the question to address is, what can be done to rid the developing world of the addiction to aid? And how can the private sector role, which you mentioned, Miriam, I think that's critical. Capacity building in private sector, talent and skilling is the way out, not trying to reform institutions which are past their sell-by date. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to pick, there was a question here, then we go to the panelists. I hope you're taking note of the pertinent questions and very hot, interesting questions. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question about the Road and Belt Initiative and the European or Western reaction to that. There was a trade called the Dow trade. There was no Silk Road. There was a product called a silk. They were bought by Indian Ocean merchants, traded in Indian Ocean small ships throughout the Indian Ocean area. Now, if we try to encourage this trade again, how much do you think would have an impact on the mega ports that rely on the road and belt? Now, Mombasa, Lamu, Adan, Cochin, Male, Mahe, you name it. There was a very, very vigorous trade, even in the 1800s. But with containerization and scaling up things, we've lost this trade. I wished that the European response was different and not exactly another similar thing as China.
Oh, thank you very much. Final, then we move, make it very succinct because time is running out.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Olga Shepelyanskaya. I represent Unicity, and we work on climate resilience in cities of the Global South. So I very much resonated with the gentleman who spoke about questioning aid in the Global South altogether. Now, at the same time, in a number of countries, for example, least developed countries, creditworthiness is just yet not there for the private sector to address immediately pressing issues such as climate change. So in that respect, I would like you to please comment on the newly emerged development financing institutions such as New Development Bank or AIIB, which are Global South-led. And do you think that they're taking a different perspective from the conventional financial sources we've just talked? And what do you think about their role and effectiveness?
All right, thank you very much. I would like to ask the panelists to respond as much as they can. And this time I'll start with David, right at the end.
Great, thank you. I'll try and touch on all of those. So in terms of the world being more diverse and not having rules, that's true. I think what we do have, though, are structures and frameworks, and the most important are the SDGs. And so I think one of the conversations that the global community needs to have at some point soon is what comes after 2030. Because in 2031, we're still going to need something. And it's really important that that is led by the UN, is universal, and is comprehensive. And I think if we can have that conversation in a positive way, hopefully it will have a positive impact in the way that aid and development are done. In terms of impact on debt, out of draws, addiction would be a fantastic opportunity to have that conversation. India's Sherpa will be speaking in a minute. Somebody should ask him. I won't comment on the French, you'll forgive me. On BRI, yes, it's a modern construct, but the Chinese aren't the only people doing that. You asked about Europe, but I think we're increasingly seeing the Indian Ocean region and the Indo-Pacific operating confidently and on its own, and I think that the idea of reconstituting old trade routes is a good one, but should probably be led by the region. And then finally, I'm afraid I just don't know enough about newly emerging Global South institutions to comment, but it sounds like a good idea.
All right, thank you very much. I know a panelist will pick it. Tanubi?
Let me start with the last question, or rather the two questions that are focused on aid addiction. I do not agree with the statement that the Bretton Woods institutions have passed their sell-by date. I think we still require them. They may not necessarily be the largest and the most dominant. They may not have the monopoly. But in a post-pandemic recovery, as we move towards a green transition pathway, all the panelists here have talked about how global institutions, multilateral development banks, including the BWIs, will play an important role. So that is there. Having said that, I agree that dependence solely on aid for economies is a very dangerous thing. And that's why I would, again, like to emphasize on the role of demand-driven assistance and partnership, but also on the role of private sector and entrepreneurship, such that the development projects are commercially viable. They're attractive for the countries in which the development projects take place, so that it's a self-sustainable project later, which comes down to certain projects which have led to debt crisis as well. So there we are. In terms of the multiplicity of actors today and what are the implications, I think I agree with all my fellow panelists here, the more the better. what is important, in the words of Christopher, is that we need to read the fine lines, the terms and conditions. I think all developing countries and recipient countries or development partner countries should have the agency to determine which development project they go with. And I think all of us are smart enough to read between the lines.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Christopher. Time is also not on our side. Please, what's your take? Respond in summary, but make it as precise as possible.
Sure. I will synthesize with all the comments and questions, and what I think the commonality that I saw there is a willingness for the countries who are receiving a lot of these alternative financing models, and as well as the traditional ones, to assert their own autonomy. You know, I heard the Indian foreign minister talk about India wanting to do things its own way, not follow the Chinese way, not follow the United States and Western way. You will find that across the board in Africa and other parts of the world, who say, yes, we want to engage the public more. Yes, we want to continue to partner with the Bretton Woods, but we have our ideas of what development looks like, and we are not content to just have people come in from London, from Paris, from Brussels, from Washington, or anywhere else and tell us and sit down in hotels, do this, do that. We also want to put ideas on the table. We want civil society. We also want the private sector. There's a lot of people in the private sector who feel like they should be heard more by their governments as well as foreign governments. And I think that we're seeing a drive for more of that.
Thank you very much. Valina?
Now I'm in the inconvenient situation to be the last speaker, because I fear that I don't have, okay, we had already good news, but I also want to point to some of the critical points. And the one is obviously being the case that there are plenty regional players that do not want to get caught in a binary world between China and United States. Now, if we look at the situation top down, the things are that we are still witnessing all the relevant US-led institutions, global institutions and structures. Whether they are efficient or not is another, of course, question. But then again, we have a copy-paste approach by China, and that relates to the question about the Global South. Basically, China trying to launch alternative structures that isolate the West, and by doing so to engage with the South. This is the case with BRICS, with the two important banks of the BRICS countries. But what is important is that next to the top-down, there is also bottom-up, and here we see that when we have a situation of a very strong dollar amid deglobalization and inflationary cycle, this is of course bad news for all emerging economies. They will reach out to other partners and try to engage, with different approaches. Here, one is of course the introduction of digital currencies, another one of cryptocurrencies, third one of crowdsourcing. So there are plenty of opportunities amid the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Okay. But once again, the victor of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is going to impose the new rules of the game, and we should be mindful of the fact that we may end up with a bifurcated world in which two alternative networks, including these global institutions, will compete with each other.
All right. Thank you. We've come to the end. I would just like to summarize it this way based on the discussions we've had. Development comes from within. It is us to decide our development trajectory. Entrepreneurship, innovations, intellectual property. How do we make agriculture a going concern? Once you have your plans in place, how do the development partners fit in? So they need to look at your terms and conditions, not you looking at their terms and conditions. Sustainable debt. What is sustainable? It is us to decide. So this is the first session for today. I know some of these are going to be dealt with in details. I would like to thank the panelists for making it very interesting. I know time is quite limited, and also for the discussions we had. I hope it will be a fruitful 2 days until we leave. Thank you very much.